morning. Thank you for having me. You guys are going to know better than anybody just the anti-establishment mood that America is in. Right? We've been lied to. I think we're all, yeah. We get it. We know it. And we're determined to end it. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in this cycle, in this nomination process. Now, the Democrats, and Democrats particularly interested in truth, right? They have a strategy to end the lie, and God bless them. They're true believers, and their solution is Bernie Sanders, and his message of hope, right? Which is not our message of hope. His message of hope is that the socialist dream is just $18 trillion in spending away. And we're going to soak the rich to pay for it, and we can get there. And, well, you got to love him for his honesty, right? I mean, that's an alternative vision, right? And he's telling you, what it is and how they're going to pay for it. But that's certainly not what we want. That's certainly not what I want. Republicans also we want the truth, right? We want somebody who's going to shoot straight with us, but not just tell us, how big government is and how we're going to pay for it. We want the truth about how we're going to cut the size of government, right? We want a candidate that's going to be honest about their plan to shrink the size and scope, right? To return us to the American experiment that Emmett referenced, right? In limited government, right? And give us back the prosperity and liberty that goes with that. And our Republican primary process, clearly reflects that, right? We've had it. We're searching for, a new leader that's actually going to change things. And I think this makes a world of sense, for Republicans that have been paying attention or that are actually awake, right? Just think about the journey that we've been on over the last 3+ decades, right? We elected Reagan, and government got bigger, right? And then we had the class of '94. We had Newt, and government got bigger. And we had George W. Bush. We had Congress. We had the Senate with the House. Government got bigger. So you've got to, we're not just going to have another election, right? We're going to have a movement. So we started the Tea Party, right? And God willing, we're going to elect a president that's going to give us our government back, our country back, our prosperity back. And the good news, we're already well on this journey. We have growing numbers in Congress that get it. That understand what needs to be done, right? Speaker Boehner's resignation is a sign that business as usual, at the very least, has become, uncomfortable. And the bad news is that while we've changed leadership, we've made little progress in actually reducing the size of the federal government. And consequently, we're not yet on the road to prosperity. And so if smaller government's part of your vision, it's certainly part of my vision, you've got to cringe every time you see the budgets that come out of the House, out of Congress. You look at that line. You pull up a Heritage website, pull up any website you want, and you look at that line of federal spending. We're now, what, 4, 5, 6 years into the Tea Party movement. You look at that line is ever sloping upward, right? And the worst news is that despite not having actually changed the size and scope of federal government, is that we've divided the Republican Party. Our party is we're at war with ourselves. The elite, the establishment Republicans and the grassroots Republicans are at each other's throats. I think everybody can see that. This is not news. Now, there's some hope that the nomination process is going to smooth over these divisions and unite the party. And I certainly hope so. But recognizing the depth of the division that exists amongst Republicans in D.C., I think we have to understand that just nominating somebody is not going to smooth these over. We need to nominate somebody with a plan, with a vision, right, of how we're going to get there. Only a nominee with a clear vision of smaller government, of smaller federal government, and a credible plan to how to get there is going to actually unite the party. Only once we're on this path, I think, will the conflict that we have today within the party kind of lead to compromise, right? Because we'll be compromising over something that we can compromise over, instead of having every fight be this existential fight about the size and scope of the federal government. I think if we could do that, we'd get back to a point where we could finally observe Reagan's 11th commandment, that we're just breaking right and left, right? Thou shalt not attack a fellow Republican. I mean, that's, I understand we had to have these fights. I understand we had to have these fights in the party, but we also have to have a vision of how we're going to get to the other side, how we're going to unite the party around a smaller vision of the federal government. So when we think about this vision, let me start by telling you what the vision's not, right? It's not a plan of tax cuts that doesn't address spending. That's not it. It's not a program-by-program description of what we're going to cut. That's not it. It's not a law that says that we're on the path. That doesn't work. And it's not an effort to purify the party. We're not going to elect all just Tea Party guys. That's not going to happen, right? We're not going to have an ideologically pure party of true believers. And it's not, and I think this is a big mistake some of us make, is it's not just force of will, right? It's not just wanting to do it more. I think we can only get there by changing the incentives. When we, the American people, talk about the system being broken, right, I think what we're really talking about is the system of incentives in D.C. are broken. So let me tell you what I mean. Let me make it very concrete. So imagine that you had a system where you could borrow all the money you want at 1%. You never have to pay it back. And if you have trouble paying it back, you can print more. Okay? That's our system. So how much would you spend? Well, most of the time, it turns out, most of you would spend a lot, like trillions. And congressmen, they're people just like you and me. I wouldn't trust myself with that system. That's a broken system. You can't fix that system with those incentives. Now, Republicans in Congress aren't dumb. They understand it, right? They're living this. They get the role that the Federal Reserve plays in facilitating government spending. They understand the incentives, and they're sincere. They want to cut. We know that. They know that. They're willing to shut down government to cut its size, right? So why aren't they willing to take on the Federal Reserve? Why is that off limits if they understand the scenario? And it's not like the Fed's delivering prosperity. Republicans can see that. They're on the campaign trail. They see people are struggling. They see this is a jobless recovery, that we have distortions, that we have financial engineering. They see that all is not well. And it's certainly not that they love Janet Yellen, right? They voted against her in record numbers. You watch the Humphrey Hawkins testimony, the biannual testimony in front of Congress. There's no love lost there. So why aren't we doing it? Why is this off the agenda? One word: fear. To be clear, we're not afraid of what happens to our government if we rein in the Federal Reserve. We know it'll get smaller. We're afraid of what happens to our economy if we rein in the Federal Reserve. What happens if the Federal Reserve can't bail us out? So let's be honest. On the one hand, the idea of intervention, government intervention to save over-leveraged banks, right, is anathema to the Republicans that embrace free markets. We don't like bailouts. Bailouts are, pull bailouts. It doesn't pull well, right? On the other hand, what would happen to the banking system if the Fed couldn't bail them out? What would happen if the Fed couldn't lend Morgan Stanley $100 billion, right, without asking anybody like they did in the last crisis? Who's going to backstop the $600 trillion in derivatives? And who's going to step in if the Fed can't? This is why we're afraid to touch the Fed. Not because of what it'll do to the federal government, but because of what it'll do to the private economy. Now, unfortunately, I don't think this fear is misplaced. The perverse part about all the bailouts that we've had is that they've made our financial system more fragile than ever, right? The solution to too much debt is always more debt. which makes the next crisis more severe than the last and makes us more dependent upon the Federal Reserve to save us again and again. So I think that's the situation we're in. So what are our nominees? What are our prospective nominees? What are they going to say, right? Where does monetary policy fit in their economic plan? And I think a real leader is not going to ignore this, right? You can't ignore this, because if we ignore the monetary system, we're not going to get the federal government on the right trajectory. And if we ignore the monetary system, we're going to continue to favor Wall Street over Main Street. If we ignore the monetary system, the Fed's overreach is only going to get worse. I don't think those are really up for debate, and let's focus on that last point, right? So here we are, we're 6 years into 6 years into a jobless recovery, 7 years of 0% interest rates, 3 rounds of quantitative easing, right? We printed $3 trillion, and we're having an endless debate about whether or not the economy can handle 25 basis points of rate increases, right? So the system is broken, right? There's not a lot of debate about that. But it's very likely things are going to get worse. If you look at the minutes from the last FOMC meeting, September 17th, they came out and they told us they're not raising rates on September 17th. And along with that, they released what's called a dot plot. I don't know if you guys saw the dot plot. There's an amazing thing about the dot plot. Some of those numbers are negative, right? So some sitting member of the FOMC is telling us, this hasn't worked so well. So the solution to the problem I now have, right, is that some member of the FOMC is suggesting that we need to start taxing people for owning dollars, 25 basis points. Specifically, the Fed funds rate is going to be negative 25 basis points. Now, theoretically, this is really, nothing new. Inflation, money printing, artificially low rates. These are all taxes on average Americans, on working Americans. These taxes they're subtle, right? Negative rates, well, negative rates are basically not so subtle. So you earn money, you save money, and you save it in your own currency, right? And the Federal Reserve, if you put it in a short-term money market with treasuries, takes some of that money away every year, right? And the idea here, right, is not to, from the Fed's perspective, why this makes sense. The idea is to punish banks for holding cash, right? So the idea is this is going to be stimulative. Don't hold all your cash with us, the Federal Reserve. We're going to charge you for that privilege. So go lend it into the economy, stimulate the economy. And that's kind of a central planning mindset that you only get from a federal institution that has a lock-solid monopoly as the purveyor of our money. But for the people, for the American people, we've been shortchanged by the recovery, lost control of our government. The idea of paying the federal government for the privilege of holding our own money I think, is a bridge too far. So we need a nominee, I think, that gets this and doesn't get it in a trivial way, doesn't get it in we need a law, right? We need a law that says we're going to amend the Federal Reserve Act and they can't make interest rates negative, right? This is the wrong way to go about this problem. This is the wrong way to leverage this overreach. Statutes aren't the solution, right? Incentives are the solution. Too big to fail, right? The big reason why we're unwilling to touch the Fed, the big thing that's wrong with our financial system, you read the introduction to Dodd-Frank. Don't read the whole thing. I mean, I haven't read the whole thing. Just the first paragraph, right? The stated purpose of that legislation is to end bailouts, to end too big to fail. Doesn't do it. I can tell you it doesn't do that. Nobody believes it does that, right? You can patch a statute that says X, Y. That's not the solution. The problem is the incentives. The other problem with the statutory strategy, the idea of moving it from the Fed to Congress and making Congress more responsible, and Emmett said this, Congress can't hold the Federal Reserve to account. I mean, the division of powers at the federal government, this is important. This is an important check. But the real division that's really going to give us back our government is taking those powers out of Washington. So how do we do that? How do we do that with monetary policy? I think we have to subject the Federal Reserve to a little competition. We have to make the market capable of holding the Federal Reserve to account, not Congress. And if they were held to account, they wouldn't be so brazen in abusing their authority. Now, the Constitution, interestingly, actually guarantees this right. Article 1, Section 10, right, gives states the right to make gold legal tender. We all have this constitutional right. And the federal government, the IRS, through interpretation, has taken it away from us. Because they tax gold as a collectible. It makes it unworkable as a monetary alternative. So there's the Fed. They can do all the central planning they want. They can abuse the monetary system. They can bail everybody out. They can take rates negative, and they know you have nowhere else to go. Well, the solution to the problem is let's return a little of that monetary authority, that monetary sovereignty back to the people. Let's have a market system that holds them to account. If they behave well, hey, that's great. You know, we're happy to use your currency. But if your currency is good, why do you have to force us to use it? Right? The Constitution gives us an alternative. Why not let us use that? And maybe only 1% of us would say on day one, well, gosh, I'm uncomfortable, right? I want something else. And then, God willing, they'd get the Federal Reserve would stop abusing its monopoly power. The federal government would start behaving a little better. We wouldn't promise things that we can't pay for. And everything would be fine. Or maybe they wouldn't get the message. Maybe they'd have to lose just a little bit more of their monopoly before they got the message. But I tell you, wouldn't have to go very far before they really started to change their behavior. And that I think, is really federalism. I think what it also, in the presidential context, does that I think is particularly interesting is it can be done through executive order, right? So it's the IRS's interpretation, not statute, that has given them this overreach to prevent any monetary alternatives circulating here in the U.S., specifically gold. Again, I think a leader needs to take this on. I think we need to see this as part of the economic proposals that are going to come out later this month. And we simply can't ignore the Federal Reserve, and we need to start changing the incentives to get better behavior out of the Federal Reserve and the federal government. Thank you very much.